The American West in the 19th century was a land of vast wilderness, towering mountains, and untapped opportunity. But it was also a place where survival was not guaranteed. A harsh and unforgiving landscape that demanded resilience from those who dared to venture into its wilderness. In the annals of Western frontier history, few stories are as chilling or as shrouded in mystery as that of Alfred Packer, the man who became known as the Colorado Cannibal. Packer's name would go down in infamy, not just as a man accused of murder, but as a man who survived in the most horrifying way imaginable, by consuming the flesh of his fellow travelers. His tale is one of survival, betrayal, and an act so unthinkable that it still echoes through Colorado folklore today. But was Alfred Packer truly a bloodthirsty monster? Or was he a man driven by desperation in a situation so dire that he had no other choice? This is the legend of Alfred Packer, the Colorado Cannibal.
In the early 1870s, the Colorado Territory was a magnet for those seeking a better life. The promise of gold and silver brought thousands of fortune seekers from all over the country, and the rugged Rocky Mountains held the allure of untold riches for those daring enough to explore its depths. But the Rockies were not a place for the faint-hearted. The winters were brutal, and the mountainous terrain could be treacherous, especially for those unfamiliar with its dangers. In November 1873, Alfred Packer, a self-proclaimed prospector and mountain guide, set out from Utah with a group of 21 men, all eager to make their fortune in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado. The group planned to travel through the Rockies to reach the Los Pinos Indian Agency, where they could resupply before heading further into the mountains to seek gold. It was an ambitious journey, but one that would prove deadly. By January 1874, the group had reached the Ute Indian encampment near Montrose, Colorado. Their chief, O'Ray, a leader of the Ute tribe, warned the men not to continue their journey. He knew the mountains better than anyone, and he knew that winter was already bearing down on the Rockies with full force. Snowdrifts could swallow men whole, and food would be scarce. Chief O'Ray offered the men shelter and provisions to wait out the winter. Some of the men heeded his warning. Others, driven by the promise of gold and wealth, did not. Alfred Packer and 5 others, Shannon Bell, Israel Swan, George California Noon, Frank Miller, and James Humphrey, decided to press on, against the advice of both Chief O'Ray and the remaining members of their party. They were determined to cross the San Juan Mountains and reach Los Pinos, believing they could outlast the brutal winter. Little did they know, only one of them would ever emerge from those mountains alive. The decision to continue the journey proved to be fatal almost from the start. The group faced snowstorms that obscured their path, and the frigid cold gnawed at their bodies as they trudged through the snow. Food supplies quickly dwindled, and hunting in the snow-covered wilderness yielded little. Within days, hunger set in, and the men were forced to ration their remaining provisions. As they pressed on deeper into the wilderness, their situation became more desperate. Weeks passed, and the group grew weaker. Frostbite, starvation, and exhaustion took their toll. The men were lost, disoriented by the unrelenting winter storms. As their desperation mounted, they began to turn on one another. Some argued that they should turn back. Others, like Packer, insisted that pressing on was their only hope of survival. By the time they were truly snowbound, trapped by the relentless cold, the group was on the brink of death. This is where the true horror of the story begins. In April 1874, nearly 2 months after they had set out, Alfred Packer stumbled into the Los Pinos Indian Agency. He was emaciated, disheveled, and alone. His story was simple. He claimed that he and his companions had run out of food and that one by one, they had succumbed to the elements. He alone had survived, wandering through the wilderness until he found his way to the agency. Packer's appearance raised immediate suspicion. Despite claiming to have been starving for weeks, he looked relatively well-fed compared to what one might expect from a man who had nearly starved to death in the mountains. His story was inconsistent, and he had in his possession a rifle, a knife, and some money, all of which were known to have belonged to his missing companions. When questioned about the whereabouts of the others, Packer said that they had all died naturally and he had been forced to resort to cannibalism to survive. His tale was met with disbelief, but there was little proof to contradict his claims. However, Packer's odd behavior and apparent lack of remorse raised eyebrows, and it wasn't long before his story began to unravel. A few weeks after Packer's arrival at the agency, searchers found the remains of his 5 companions in a remote area of the San Juan Mountains near what is now known as Dead Man's Gulch. The scene was ghastly. The bodies were not simply those of men who had died of exposure or starvation. They had been brutally butchered. The evidence told a story far different from the one Packer had told. The bodies showed signs of violence. Skulls had been crushed, and limbs had been cut with precision. It was clear that the men had been murdered, not simply left to die from the elements. And most chilling of all, their flesh had been stripped from their bones, confirming that Packer had indeed resorted to cannibalism. The discovery of the mutilated remains ignited a firestorm of outrage and fear. The once friendly prospector was now branded a monster. Packer was immediately arrested and charged with murder. But before he could stand trial, Packer escaped from custody, disappearing into the vast wilderness, becoming a fugitive. For 9 years, Alfred Packer remained on the run, evading authorities as the legend of the Colorado Cannibal grew. Finally, in 1883, Packer was captured in Cheyenne, Wyoming. By the time he was brought back to Colorado to stand trial, he had become a household name, a figure of both horror and fascination. At his trial, Packer changed his story multiple times. In one version, he claimed that Shannon Bell had gone mad from hunger and killed the others, forcing Packer to kill Bell in self-defense. In another version, Packer admitted to killing Bell, but claimed it was an act of mercy to end his suffering. Throughout the trial, Packer maintained that he had no choice but to consume the bodies of his companions to survive. The jury didn't buy it. On April 13, 1883, Alfred Packer was convicted of premeditated murder and sentenced to death. The judge allegedly declared, "There were 7 Democrats in Hinsdale County, but you voracious, man-eating son of a bitch, you ate 5 of them." This quote, though likely apocryphal, has become part of the legend surrounding the case. However, Packer's sentence was eventually overturned on a technicality, and in a subsequent trial in 1886, he was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 40 years in prison. At that time, the longest sentence ever handed down in Colorado history. Alfred Packer was paroled in 1901 after serving 17 years in prison. He lived out his final years in relative obscurity, dying in 1907 at the age of 65. To the end, he maintained that he had acted in self-defense and had only eaten human flesh to survive. The legend of Alfred Packer has endured long after his death. In the decades following his trial, Packer became a notorious figure in Colorado folklore, with some viewing him as a cold-blooded killer and others as a man forced to commit unthinkable acts in the face of death. His story has been retold in books, documentaries, and even films, cementing his place in the darker side of American frontier history. The area where the bodies were discovered, once a remote part of the San Juan Mountains, is now a tourist destination, with hikers and adventurers visiting Dead Man's Gulch to learn more about the gruesome events that unfolded there. The town of Lake City, Colorado, where Packer was tried, hosts an annual Alfred Packer Festival, a morbid celebration of the man who became the state's most infamous cannibal. Despite the horror of his actions, Packer has become something of a folk hero in some circles, a symbol of the extreme lengths one might go to in order to survive in the face of death. His legacy, both fascinating and grotesque, continues to intrigue those who are drawn to the macabre and the mysteries of the Old West. The legend of the Colorado Cannibal is one of the most chilling stories in American history. It is a tale that forces us to confront the darkest corners of human nature, the instinct to survive, even at the cost of our humanity. Was Alfred Packer truly a murderer, driven by greed and malice, or was he simply a man who found himself in an impossible situation?